morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or whatever it is in your part of the world. My name is Francisco, he pronouns, and I'll be the moderator for this session. I'll be monitoring the chat, so just let me know if you have any needs while we're together. Please reach out to Ren Willow if you have any technical issues. We will be recording this session so that participants can revisit the information afterwards if they want to. If you don't feel comfortable, you can turn off your camera. We will not be recording any breakout rooms that might be created. Okay, so we'll be starting with Yael Armangau from the University of Toulouse 2, LISST, France. Yael is a PhD student at this university in Jean Jaurès, France. His doctoral research aims to analyze, through a situated perspective, trans paths and their ordeals through support networks, both online and offline. The title of his presentation is Between Critique of the Institutions and Empowerment Perspectives, the use of trans-only Facebook groups as an intra-community tool. Oh, and before you start, Yael, I wanted to clarify that please, as we've seen in the last session, we need people to speak as slowly as they, well, not as slowly as they can, but we need people to speak pretty slowly so that we have time for the interpreters to do their work properly. And also you have 15 minutes and I will remind you 15 minutes before your time is up. Thank you, and Yael, you can begin.
Thank you. Alors, je vais partager mon écran. Est-ce que c'est bon?
Yes, we can see it.
Merci. Donc,
then I will start the presentation and I will be talking about the different... Ay, se cortó.
Et je vais présenter ensuite mes résultats divisés en deux sections, centrées premièrement sur le soutien informationnel et deuxièmement sur le soutien émotionnel. Je terminerai par une rapide discussion. Avant de commencer, une brève contextualisation.
Before we start, I would like to contextualize everything. We work in France and we talked about the context that we need to consider. For the first time, we talked about the issue.
Un véritable bouclier thérapeutique. Donc, grossièrement, il y a deux possibilités de parcours trans en France. La voie dite officielle, gérée par la SOFECT, Société française d'études et de prise en charge du transsexualisme, qui adopte une approche psychiatrisante et des critères d'entrée très stricts, et une voie plus individualisée, dans laquelle les personnes choisissent ce qu'elles veulent ou ne veulent pas. Mais dans cette approche-là, et de plus en plus fréquemment dernièrement, il y a des refus de bénéficier de la gratuité et du remboursement des soins du système médical français à cause de la mainmise de la SOFECT, donc la première possibilité. Donc face à ces difficultés-là, les personnes trans ont créé différents réseaux de partage d'informations et de soutien social pour s'aider, à la fois par les associations d'autosupport IRL, mais aussi en créant des communautés en ligne. Donc, en suivant le modèle proposé par Cutrona et Sur, je considère que ces communautés ont fourni au fil du temps 5 types de soutien social: informationnel, émotionnel, lié à l'estime, lié au réseau et instrumental. Récemment, de nombreuses études ont mis en évidence l'importance croissante des communautés en ligne dans la gestion des parcours trans, en raison de leur capacité à permettre l'autonomisation, à lutter contre l'isolement social et à améliorer le bien-être.
We will try to empower people. We will also deal with social isolation, and we will try to improve people's hopes. We will be seeing the results through the online interaction, especially in France, where the topic is insufficiently addressed. In the past, this was done through conversations in large cities, So the first French-speaking online trans exchange networks were held in France. The first online communities in France were created in the 1980s. Some servers were administered by the Paris Association of Trans People. This was accessed privately, and it allowed for real-time access, and it allowed people to organize meetings. Unfortunately, there are no records of all this, and no work has been conducted on the beginnings of these studies. They were considered sex heroes. So actually, they didn't want to leave any traces. But we also know some things about tools for sexual encounters and how all this affected trans people as well.
En ligne francophones trans se sont fortement inspirés des communautés anglophones. Donc, les premières formes de
we need to remember that the first French-speaking spaces were different, and most of them were English-speaking at the very beginning.
J'ai souhaité faire apparaître dans ma communication les trois femmes représentées sur la slide, précurseuses des communautés trans en ligne. À gauche, la programmeuse Gwendoline Ann Smith, qui a lancé en 1994 la room Gazebo, qui est devenue rapidement un espace de ressources, circulation d'informations et mise en relation entre personnes concernées. Et c'était très populaire parce que ça ne nécessitait pas de compétences.
Other people implied, and it didn't exist. There was no competition for her. Then we have Melanie Phillips in 1994 after a blog about trans trajectories, and then Anne Lawrence in 1996. Then all blogs continued to grow, gathering the main people to access information and the state of trans stories. Then we had the first trans forums, very advanced, with access to information for all. And then media uses started, and we continue with blogs. Finally, the use of the web by trans people through different platforms and formats gave birth to a lexis, a vocabulary that allows to get to a community. And these online spaces are deeply aligned to trans trajectories. This is why trans people are interested in these spaces, like characterized practices that teach about the implied people. The information I bring is mainly about medical protocols and in particular about alternatives. First, the circulation of information about the professionals and professional knowledge. The circulation of health information has two scopes: identifying allies and references. Research uses all the same format: the medical community and the goal of the consultation. The technical support element can be individual or collective, face to the medical administration. Individual prevention implies analyzing, and collective prevention implies mainly tracing, which which allows to have easy access for identities and individual desires, avoiding French hospitals. This is a collective tool in charge of full devices. We don't know if this is going to be a reality where certain medical care insists on the legal aspects. The exchanges related to trans persons are thinking of care around practice, and rather than an interest in protocols, which should be deviated according to adapting to needs of healthcare. Institutional support then allows for community and medical support for the individuals and communities. Following the circulation, the dissemination of knowledge, we see a medical aspect. There are resources of difficult access before we reverse the hierarchy of knowledge. For example, we can adjust times and we can develop knowledge that we will then disseminate in a different way. In the second axis, my observations are based on the centrality of emotional support in the exchanges within groups. We can see long public posts that have a particular form and an urgent status. We see the words urgent, help, suicide, and the most important themes are related to emotions and what the users use. In particular, the institutions, be it medical or educational. I also see the main sources of emotional supports that can be identified traditionally in literature, that is, the main causes that require support expressed by trans persons, and how this support is carried out in the community. From an emotional point of view, people can see clearly the social and medical problems, and this is related to the realities related to emotional support and the methods applied by users and groups to respond to these specific needs.
So now we have 4 or 5 minutes left. Sorry, thank you.
In other terms, sorry, I have only 4 minutes left. My results are based on the need to support and accompany trans people, and this accompany based on the needs of trans people. And Facebook and internet in general, we see intra-community tools that support mutual aid for joint initiatives. For example, the creation of tools to create spaces of negotiation, the centrality of emotional issues, the dissemination of knowledge and building knowledge and hierarchy, and mutual aid between, and the dissemination related to the dissemination of money, objects. For all these practices, trans persons define the institutions and the formulation of resistance, favoring the empowerment. We need to emphasize the way in which trans persons exchange knowledge and the bad functioning of current devices. What is clear for trans persons is what we expect from the results. Care has to be efficient for and through trans persons. To finish, to conclude, while these spaces sometimes are safe, there is some kind of discrimination. For example, the normative behavior, sexist, racist behavior. The continuity of my research is to see how intra-community aid and the effects on trans people observed on the field, to see if the majority of trans persons can defend from these attacks on humanity and dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yael. You stayed well within time. Something I forgot to ask at the beginning is we are asking all presenters if they are okay with having their presentation discussed on social media, on Twitter, for example. I think, Yael, you had indicated you are not okay with that, right?
No, it's okay.
Oh, it is okay to
Yeah.
post about this. Oh, okay, thank you. And now we're going to move on to Theodore Davenport, who has indicated that he's also okay with his presentation being discussed. So I'm going to introduce him now. Theodore Davenport is a PhD student in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. He is an emergent scholar in trans geographies whose research bridges conversations within feminist geographies, humanistic trans studies, science and technology studies, socio-legal studies, and care ethics. His presentation is titled Trans Geographies of Care, Normativity, Contradictions, and Intersectionality. Teddy, you can begin.
All right, wonderful. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see and hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so today I am very excited to share my presentation, which you'll notice does have a different title now, named Normativity and Contradictions in Trans Care Ethics. This comes out of my master's research at University of Washington's Department of Geography, where I'm currently a PhD student. The most common narrative of care that I hear within trans communities goes something like this. Trans and gender nonconforming people have been historically marginalized, oppressed, and forgotten. The shrouds of death and suffering loom above us at all times. However, our transphobic and cis-sexist society care little about our pain and will do little, if anything, to save us. Therefore, the only way towards trans liberation and happiness is through community care. While there are many truths within this narrative regarding trans precarity, positioning community care as the sole savior of trans communities glosses over the ways that care can be complicated, fraught, or even harmful. In this presentation, I trace a recent history of transgender care networks to trouble underlying assumptions of care as a universal positive by highlighting contradictions in caring relationships and practices. I draw from Bernice Fisher and Joan Toronto's expansive definition of care as, quote, a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. As previously mentioned, this presentation comes out of my master's research, a project which analyzed 25 oral history interview transcripts from the New York City Trans Oral History Project, an open source archive with audio and transcriptions of over 150 life history interviews with trans current or former New York residents. This is one of the largest trans oral history community archives in the United States, with open online access to interviews, although minimal academic work has yet drawn from this data. This collection was selected for its online accessibility, large number of interviews, focus on everyday lived experiences of transgender people, and availability of both interview audio and transcripts, All narrators have given informed consent to contribute to the archive with the explicit understanding that their data may be used in a wide variety of contexts, including research projects. In this presentation, I highlight just 2 interviews from the New York City Trans Oral History Project that reveal productive tensions surrounding trans experiences of community care. First, I evaluate the experiences of one interviewee, Naomi Clark, in navigating online trans websites and forums during the early 2000s. I consider how such websites often gave advice intended to help trans people pass as cisgender in order to circumvent transphobia. I read this advice through the lens of transnormativity, which I will explain later in more detail. I argue that exchanging passing advice constitutes an attempt to, in Fisher and Toronto's terms, continue one's world, and such advice emphasizes the contradictions and tensions in trans care that is grounded in survival. Second, I consider the case of the Transy House, a house that was owned by trans couple Rusty Mae Moore and Chelsea Goodwin in Brooklyn during the 1990s and 2000s. Over time, this house came to serve as an informal emergency shelter for trans people in New York. I contend that this trans space highlights a transgender care ethic while simultaneously revealing the extent to which trans people are abandoned by ostensibly caring agents, including families of origin, cisgender sex workers, housing authorities, and other state actors. This section follows Naomi Clark's experiences with transdigital spaces during the early 2000s. Naomi is a queer trans woman of Japanese heritage in her mid-40s who grew up in Seattle, Washington, and initially moved to New York City for college. She currently works as a professor at the New York University, where she teaches video game design. In the past, she worked in web design at a diverse array of places, including toy company Lego and Lambda Legal. Naomi is also highly involved in New York trans politics and was also one of the earliest members of the Sylvia Rivera Rights Project, a trans legal collective founded by Dean Spade. Her interview
Theodore,
speaks to...
sorry
Yes.
for the interruption. The interpreters are saying that you're going a little bit too fast. If you could go a bit slower, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Naomi is also highly involved in New York trans politics and was also one of the earliest members of the Sylvia Rivera Rights Project, a trans legal collective founded by Dean Spade. Her interview speaks to the importance of the internet's early years in trans community formation. Naomi discusses how members of forums towards trans women read the stakes and goals of transitioning. Created in 1996 by trans woman Susan Larson, Susan Place was and remains one of the most popular trans-centered websites based in the US. As early as June 1998, Susan's Place provided several trans resources, including a library, a personal messaging system, a chat forum, and the first ever web search engine dedicated to trans resources in 1997, predating the incorporation of Google by at least 1 year. Naomi discovered Susan's Place in 2002 prior to finding in-person trans community in her new residence of New York City. Naomi discusses how Susan's Place was one of the only places where she had access to other trans people. However, she notes that other members on the forums often cited passing as cisgender as the ultimate goal of transition. I'm realizing now that I don't think that I've shared audio on my screen sharing, so please give me a second to stop sharing and fix that. Thank you for your patience.
It was all this very, like, passing-oriented, what I think of as now is like the pretty conservative transition advice, where it was like, oh, you know, post a picture of yourself wearing makeup and we'll criticize your makeup. There was sort of no hint of trans liberation or anything that was very, like, like genuinely trans positive. And I chafed against it a lot, but I was also just trying to figure out like how I could actually survive and get by. And they're not like the only trans people that I knew. It was all this very.
One lens that is particularly useful for understanding Naomi's experiences is that of transnormativity, or the normalization of trans bodies and identities through the adoption of cisgender institutions by trans persons, including gender normativity, the medical establishment, government institutions, identification documents, and historical narratives. Trans creators of online material that provided advice on transitioning technologies highlight the tensions and stakes behind transnormative passing politics. Although Naomi criticizes how members of Susan's Place often fail to engage with critical trans politics, she readily recognizes the importance of these practices for members of this online community. She argues that most of this advice was intended to help members, quote, get by, and quote, figure out some way to get people to tolerate them. In a world where survival as a trans person often depends as being perceived as cisgender, exchanging advice to pass ironically serves as a mode of care intended to, as Fisher in Toronto put, continue one's world. While passing advice itself is often fraught with transnormative ideals, the act of exchanging advice constitutes an important form of community care within online spaces like Susan's Place, because it conveys an attempt to help others persist with living while trans. However, as trans scholars such as Jules Gill-Peterson argue, such passing advice reifies an aesthetic ideal that centers both cis normativity and whiteness. These trans spaces of digital care represent heterogeneous values that trouble care as normatively good and show how care is often fraught with power.
You have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Within the selected life stories from the New York City Trans Oral History Project, many interviewees discuss difficulties around securing housing while trans, resulting from factors such as economic precarity and housing discrimination. Here, I highlight how two interviewees, Chelsea Goodwin and Rusty May Moore, reluctantly engaged in housing provision as a form of trans community care. Although they did not intend for their house to serve as a refuge for trans people needing housing, word quickly spread that they had room and the ability to provide space for trans people in need in their, what they called the Transy House in Brooklyn. Chelsea discusses the caring landscape for trans people in New York during this time.
Even that law originally exempted the homeless shelters, which meant that every time a social worker got a transgender person and didn't know where to place them, they'd call us, or just, without even notifying us, send them to our door, and I'd be working in my office. Their doorbell would ring, I'd come downstairs. There'd be some homeless trans person there standing there, and I'd be like, oh yes, may I help you? And so-and-so from such and such institution, shelter, organization, or whatever sent me, and there they are with their satchel or whatever, and I'm like, all right, come in and we'll see what we can do to get you sorted out. Even
Chelsea Goodwin describes her time in the Transy House akin to a reluctant caregiver, saying, it was social work, only I didn't have a master of social work and I wasn't getting paid. Many of the people that she had found themselves abandoned by a number of ostensibly caring agents, including families of origin, social workers, housing authorities, and other state actors. In lieu of existing social supports, interviewees had to find creative fixes to housing difficulties. While such workarounds showcase the resiliency of interviewees in the face of housing discrimination, they also reveal how trans people are particularly affected by economic injustice, housing discrimination, and administrative violence. Continuing trans worlds involves a number of disparate and sometimes competing caring practices. While care is an essential part of trans survival and thriving, as scholars such as Hel Malatino and Amy Marvin have noted, we can't gloss over the many ways that care can be messy and unwieldy. At the start of this presentation, I described how trans care ethics are often portrayed as the savior of trans communities. I think that parts of this narrative are absolutely true, and that without care, our communities would not survive, let alone thrive. However, considering the messier aspects of care better prepares us for the moments when care feels more laborious than joyful. While transgender people do not experience or enact care practices in universally homogeneous, positive, or uncritical ways, allowing care to be complicated helps us to better understand lived trans experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Theodore. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Max Osborn's presentation. Unfortunately, Max couldn't be here today, but they sent us a video with their presentation. Let me pull it up. Oh, first I'm going to read their introduction. Max Osborn, MA, is a PhD candidate at the City University of New York Graduate Center and John Jay College, USA. They hold a master's degree in forensic psychology. Just a second, I'm making sure that I share with sound. Could you hear that? I'm not sure I'm sharing with sound.
No, I can't hear it.
Yes or no? Sorry.
Which language channel are you on?
It doesn't matter, but could you hear? Oh, well, oh, right.
I couldn't
This
hear
would be
it.
English channel. Did you not hear anything?
No.
Oh, yeah. Does anyone remember quickly how to share with sound?
At view, or up at screen share options, the banner at the top, go all the way to the right. There might be like a ... symbol or something. Click that, and then it will be share with sound.
Okay, sorry.
And if you want, I can try it if you send me the link.
Should I be advanced video? Oh, share sound. Share sound, I think. Share. Can you see and hear now? Well, can you at least see?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Max.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, yes.
But Mauricio asked if you could play it at 75% speed.
Yeah.
And I think because we're missing a presenter, you probably can. And we can just keep an eye on time.
Oh, yeah, but could you hear it?
I can hear it, yes. Sorry.
Okay, so I'll play it now.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Max Osborn. I'm a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I will be presenting some preliminary findings on trans and non-binary care and support during the COVID-19 pandemic. I first want to apologize that I can't be there with you live. I actually had top surgery last week and then experienced some unexpected complications. And the rescheduled follow-up visit ended up conflicting with my scheduled presentation time. So I do apologize for that, but I do hope to be around for the rest of the weekend, and I will be checking the platform. So please do leave questions if you have them, and I will try to get back to you. And I do want to thank the conference organizers again for being so flexible and letting me put this video together, and being so accommodating of my own trans health needs at this trans health conference. So to begin, as most of us are well aware, trans and non-binary people experience numerous obstacles accessing formal support services, including provider gatekeeping, discrimination and lack of cultural competence, internalized stigma, and lack of availability and affordability. Many of the presentations we'll see this weekend, I would imagine, deal with exactly these obstacles. As a result, informal networks of care have emerged within trans communities, with many preferring to rely on trusted peers or community members rather than service providers or institutions. In the excellent book titled Trans Care, Hilma Latino states that, quote, "Some of what binds us to one another is directly tied to the affective and practical disinvestment of the people and institutions we've needed or been forced to rely upon for survival. We have learned to care for one another in the aftermath of these refusals," end quote. The history of this communal care includes direct one-to-one peer interactions and friend groups, but also support groups, activism and organizing, zines and newsletters to share resources, and crowdfunding for medical expenses, among other things. Over the past year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified existing inequities and access barriers, as well as prompting the expansion of informal forms of support. And it's that latter topic that I'd like to talk a little bit more about today. So I focus here on two research questions. One, what strategies do trans and non-binary people use to give and receive emotional and material support outside of formal or institutional contexts? And two, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted trans and non-binary support networks? So this data was taken from my dissertation, which is a broader project on institutional contact and help seeking among LGBTQIA+ people. So for this analysis, I only included data from the 31 participants who identified as transgender and or non-binary. I conducted semi-structured interviews over Zoom in the fall of 2020, covering topics such as identity and presentation, risk and safety across contexts, police encounters, formal and informal help seeking and support services, and the pandemic. To give a brief overview of the sample, participants' ages range from 21 to 56 years old with a mean of 31 years. And I am showing overviews of race, gender, and sexual orientation here, but I want to note that I ask people to self-identify with whatever words felt applicable to them, rather than giving a closed-ended list of options. So I think that's always preferable, but it also does make it harder to summarize and present. So just in terms of the gender breakdown, I want to first state that roughly 2/3 of participants self-identified as non-binary. So that's one way of looking at things. And also as an alternative, I am noting like which percentage of people identified themselves as transmasculine, either binary or non-binary, transfeminine, non-binary without referencing either masculinity or femininity or something else entirely. And again, it gets complicated because people used multiple identity terms to describe themselves, or used unique terms that weren't shared by other people. So obviously neither of these presentations is going to fully capture the complexity of the sample. But I am still navigating how to summarize the information usefully without reducing people to categories that flatten their identities. And a final note, whenever I refer to a specific participant using identity terms for race, gender, or sexual orientation, I'm using the language that they chose for themselves. So for the rest of this presentation, I would like to discuss some of the advantages and challenges that trans and non-binary people encountered when engaging with informal support networks during the pandemic, and also to spotlight some of the participants' perspectives. In terms of people's experiences during the pandemic, findings were fairly consistent with existing literature showing that the pandemic exacerbated existing barriers to accessing formal support. So people had new or increased medical, mental health, and financial needs, and encountered provider overload and burnout. Unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, as in general, trans and non-binary people frequently turn to informal sources of support, such as friends, family, partners, and each other. Notably, most of the people I talked to discussed not only receiving support, but also ways they were engaged in giving support to other people in their communities, either as part of an organized effort or on a one-to-one basis. So very few people describe themselves as only giving or only receiving. And this is just some of the types of informal support that people gave and received, which included distributing food and supplies, donating to bail funds for people who've been arrested, exchanging information or skills such as teaching or translating, and fundraising for housing and medical costs. So to kind of summarize this, impetus behind this support. Here's a quote by one of the participants, who is a Vietnamese non-binary person who's 26 years old, explaining why they chose primarily to rely on informal sources of support during the pandemic. Institutions are already doing a roundabout way of trying to take care of you, or the systems are being compromised like they are right now. Why would I trust in somebody that hasn't been able to help me? Why wouldn't I lean on the people that are in the same here and now as I am? Like my neighbors, my friends, lovers, whoever. So this person viewed commonality of experience and identity as really important in determining who they felt comfortable relying on. They wanted to receive care from people who had been in similar situations to their own and whom they felt that they could relate to. And this was a sentiment that was shared by a number of participants. Next, I want to briefly discuss some strengths and advantages to relying on informal support and community care networks during the pandemic, and specifically how trans people's socializing and communication changed. So participants described their social circles becoming smaller and more close-knit, their communication and boundary setting skills developing, and mutual aid and organized support efforts growing and expanding. So first, people stated that their social circles contracted in terms of size, but became much closer. So peripheral acquaintances and friends kind of fell away, leaving behind groups of friends and family that were smaller, but that people perceived as much more reliable and more able to give support. So this is a quote from a white, Jewish, and Latino woman describing her experience receiving support during the pandemic. There has been a winnowing of everyone's relationships. I think the question of who is a friend and who is an acquaintance since this whole situation started has become a lot less ambiguous. I know who my friends are, and I know who my colleagues are, and I know who my acquaintances are. That is a lot more black and white now. It has been very isolating for me, and I feel like there are far fewer people I can call on for support. But the people I can call on for support, I know I can count on them. And similarly, another quote, this one is from a 56-year-old Black and Hispanic woman describing her approach to helping other people in her circles. Because of the pandemic, I check in with people regularly. Because the thing is, you never know. You have to check on people because people are important to me. People are important, especially my close circles. And so I try to stay in contact with them to make sure they're all right. I mean, I try to do something every day. So essentially, participants reporting more frequent, closer, and more intense contact with fewer people, especially in terms of giving and receiving care. And sometimes this involves sharing material resources, but it appeared equally important to maintain frequent communication with other people and offer emotional support if needed. And next, participants talked about how their communication skills developed during this period of crisis. So one of the same participants I quoted before also stated, during the pandemic right now, you're just being tested on the different ways you need to adapt to communicate with whoever it is that you want to be close with. And this person went on to talk more about how they had learned to better articulate and communicate their emotional needs to other people, including setting boundaries about the type of social interactions that they had the energy for, what they wanted or didn't want from interactions. And they mentioned that this seemed to come about directly as a result of the pandemic. So essentially the upheaval of normal social patterns of interaction allowed for a renegotiation of norms and boundaries, and presented an opportunity for people to more clearly set the terms for the types of interactions they needed and desired. Not only that, but the mutual understanding that everyone was under an intense amount of stress created opportunities for extending empathy to others and also prompted a tendency to be more accommodating to other people's needs. And not only that, but also to be more proactive about asking explicitly about those needs. So this represented not just a shift in the type of care being practiced, but in the way that care processes and social interactions were being navigated. And lastly, many participants mentioned becoming involved with mutual aid groups or community care efforts that either had not existed prior to the pandemic or that they had not previously been involved with. Again, this seems like kind of an obvious response to the increased need for services and care among trans communities and the continued difficulties with formal service access. But participants also mentioned that they felt really motivated to help others and that they felt especially compelled to do so because it was a crisis. So the pandemic kind of became a catalyst for people who had not previously been involved in group care work to now finally take that step. Next, I want to talk about some of the major obstacles to trans people giving and receiving care during the pandemic. The first being social isolation, and the second being increased strain on existing networks. Although, as I mentioned, many people felt newly motivated to get involved in community care efforts or to check up on their loved ones, the lack of normal social interaction was unsurprisingly really hard on people's mental health and impeded these care processes for a lot of people. While the understanding that everyone was under a lot of stress created a sense of solidarity and empathy, it also created an impression among some participants that because everyone was struggling, it was harder to feel that other people were available to be called on. And also sometimes harder to kind of muster up the energy to offer support to other people. So this is a quote from one of the participants, a 28-year-old white and Jewish non-binary person. We're all dealing with so much stress and life stuff separately that there's sometimes less day-to-day support or kind of like preventative support available, where it's like, oh, I'm just not getting these regular interactions that are nourishing. Participants also described how the pandemic placed even more of a burden on the people who are already dealing with the most intense inequities or who could experience the most trauma in the first place. So this is kind of a longer quote, but I think it's an important one. This is from a 21-year-old Indian American non-binary gender queer person. We already know institutions have been harming us and have failed us. I'm tasked now with understanding why we are also doing that. We're unable to support each other and why we're continuing to fail us and not support us. You have to be constantly communicating your boundaries and needs and all this stuff, which is also something that's more accessible to privileged queer people than it is for other people, right? To even process your emotions in a certain way and identify your triggers. When you're still trying to meet your basic needs also, it's not something that you can prioritize. So I want to bring this up, especially because it's been demonstrated that informal community care networks can often inadvertently replicate existing power hierarchies and inequalities. So I'm thinking like specifically of Chris Barcelos's work on crowdfunding for trans medical care, and how it often turns out that relatively more privileged people, such as white transmasculine people, end up being most successful at gaining an audience or raising money. And in this example, this participant expressed that the people in their community who were already under the most stress and who often had the least access to formal supports like mental health care and other resources for handling those stresses, were now in the midst of this crisis being called upon to kind of expertly navigate their own traumas in a way that was like healthy, productive, avoiding harm to others, and that was a kind of an extraordinary burden to place on people, and a burden that has only intensified as energy and resources became spread thin during the pandemic. So to recap, while the pandemic prompted a lot of non-binary and trans people to strengthen their core social networks, reassess their communication styles and boundaries, and become more involved in community care efforts, it also placed an increased burden on the people who are already struggling the most and threatened to reproduce existing inequities in access to care and resources. Therefore, I would suggest that it's important to both seize these new opportunities to adjust communication styles and the organization of care networks and potentially improve them, but also that it's crucial during these adjustments to center members of trans communities who are being the most impacted by the pandemic and who had the greatest obstacles to accessing care beforehand. And in general, to constantly examine who is being left out of care networks, how are resources being allocated, and who is taking on the most responsibility in caring for others. And I want to close out on a bit of a hopeful note with another participant's words, which are the inspiration for the title of this presentation. So this is a quote from a 30-year-old white person who self-identified as a gender variant dyke. I think it continues to kind of be our legacy. There's something about queer people and community, the way we make space with each other, that fosters itself outside an institution. And I find that fascinating. Like we can have even have all the queer theory studies programs and all the grad schools, and even still the way we gather will be different. You know, I don't think that's something that will go away soon. I think that's one of the beautiful parts about it. So, sorry, not to disparage the research that we're all here this weekend to present and discuss, but obviously academia is very much an institution, just as medical providers, the legal system, and social services are institutions. And I want to point to the importance of recognizing how and why that process of making space outside of institutions occurs organically. And the difficulty of summing up the nuances of these care networks and practices, especially in a 15-minute presentation of qualitative data. But I'm always available to talk more often, either about these findings or these topics more generally, and would definitely welcome any questions or comments on this work that is very much still in development.
Okay, so that was Max's presentation, and now for our last presentation by Leo Valdés from Rutgers University. Leo Valdés is a PhD student in the history department at Rutgers University. They study 20th century Black and Latina diasporic history based in the United States and centering trans and gender variant people's politics and resistance. Leo has indicated that they're okay with people discussing their work on social media, just to let you know. And Leo, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Francisco. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not able to share my screen right now for some reason. Usually I just hit share my screen. Does anyone have, can anyone help me, please?
Yeah, I'm trying to check because I made you co-host, but let me make sure that I made you co-host. Oh yeah, you're a co-host. You should be able to do that. Who can share? All panelists. Laura, are you there? Could you have any ideas?
Okay, there we go.
Oh, yeah,
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, can you all see my presentation?
No, we can see like some mountains.
You can see mountains. Really? You can't, you can see, okay, so you can see my desktop. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. Yes?
When you click on share screen, you can choose between sharing a specific window or your entire screen.
Huh. I see.
You might have to disable share screen first to restart it.
Right. Okay. All right. What is going on? I am so sorry. I don't know why this is happening. Sorry, I'm nervous, so I can't really think straight. Okay, it looks like I should be able to share now. Do you all see it?
Yes, yeah. That's working.
Okay, great. All right, so I will just try to make up for that time lost. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Leo Valdés. I'm a fourth year history PhD student in the at Rutgers University. So my presentation is called In the Shadow of the Healthcare City, Historicizing Trans Latinx Immigrant Experiences During the Coronavirus Pandemic. And it's
Leo, sorry to interrupt you. If you could please not speak that quickly, you'll have 15 minutes. We won't have time for questions and answers anyway, so you can use your full 15 minutes. Don't worry.
All right, thank you. So this presentation is based on an article that will be published in the fall, and it's based on research that I do every summer with the Latino New Jersey Oral History Project. And what we do is conduct oral history interviews with Latinx people in New Jersey. And one of the reasons that that is important is because New Jersey is underrepresented in Latinx history. And in fact, New York is a little bit as well. New Jersey and New York, the metropolitan area, have the highest number of undocumented immigrants in the entire United States. You might think that it's the Southwest or the West, but it's actually New Jersey and New York. So I'm going to start with a little narrative. When Mercedes Martinez lay in bed alone, fighting the wretched symptoms of COVID-19, merely blocks away from the renowned Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey, she began seeing demons as she described her hallucinations. During the nights, from the very high fever that I had, I began seeing demons. I saw very strange things. I cried very, very hard. I thought I was going to die. Martinez is an undocumented Mexican transgender woman living in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Like most of the Mexican, Central American, and broader Latinx immigrant community in New Brunswick, she lives in the shadow of the healthcare city, steps away from cutting-edge research and medical facilities, but largely unable to access that care. So New Brunswick, New Jersey is located halfway between Philadelphia and New York City. It is home to the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson, a pharmaceutical conglomerate which grossed $100 billion in 2019 alone. New Brunswick is a really interesting city. It has a population of about 55,000, half of whom are Hispanic, according to the census. And within the Hispanic population, close to 30% are Mexican. There are some statistics that will characterize this city for you or bring it to life in your head. In 2017, the median household income in New Brunswick was little over $38,000. But in the surrounding wealthy suburbs where hospital and university employees live, Johnson & Johnson employees, Rutgers employees, the median household income is upwards of $200,000. More startling, the city had a poverty rate of 34%, which is triple the county's rate of about 11%. So New Brunswick is characterized by racial and economic segregation. It's basically a strip of commercial activity where the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson are, the Rutgers University campus, and then segregated from that by French Street, which is the street on the lower picture on the slide, is the Latinx community. Since the 1960s, New Brunswick has seen incredible transformations, one of which is Latinx immigration. In 1950, for example, the white non-Hispanic residents, white people in New Brunswick were 95% of the population. And when you get to the 2000s, half of that population is gone. And why did that happen? Well, like other cities across the United States, white flight, which was a mass exodus of white people from cities in response to the Great Migration of African Americans, and in New Brunswick, for example, Puerto Rican migration, which occurred in the second half of the 20th century. So this led to two competing visions of the city. On the one hand, the city government was faced with a fiscal crisis in response to white flight, where the tax base was decimated. And so it wanted to bring back commercial activity into the city. And that involved displacing the city's African-American and Puerto Rican communities. So that was one thing that was happening in the post-1960s period, fueled in part by public-private partnerships between Rutgers, the government, and Johnson & Johnson. And the other half of the city was the Latinx community that was growing in part because of waves of Latinx immigration, in particular Mexican immigration. And one illustration of these competing visions of the city is a little park in the middle of New Brunswick called War Memorial Park. But it was renamed by the Mexican population of the city as Parque Oaxaca. Oaxaca is a southern state of Mexico. And it was also renamed by other people as Parque Joteria, which literally translates to faggot park. Some people use it in a derogatory sense and others do not. So that's kind of a illustration of what the city is like and what it's characterized as. So my research deals with the trans immigrants who live in New Brunswick. I interviewed only trans women for this study, but that is going to change soon. It's an ongoing research project. So this is Liza Mendez. She's one of the women who I interviewed. She is from Guatemala, and she is a formerly undocumented immigrant. So trans immigrants live within a broader Latinx impoverished community in New Brunswick. And one of the premises that my research is based on is that in order to understand trans people, we can't only look at gender. We have to look at race and we have to look at ethnicity. And one of the reasons is because trans people who come from these communities, their first their first entry point into the larger communities is through the communities that they're born into, especially when it comes to immigrants who are undocumented or who primarily speak the languages of their home countries, in this case, Spanish. So I think that's just a really important method for moving forward in trans studies, and especially when you look at healthcare disparities and economic disparities. Liza Mendez, Mercedes Martinez, who I quoted in the beginning, these women can be characterized as sexiles, which is what some scholars have used to describe their immigration. I think that, and I can talk about this a little bit later perhaps, but sexiles kind of emphasizes sexual oppression. And what I found doing oral histories is that actually trans women and in some other oral histories, trans men and other genders document being oppressed on the basis of their gender long before they came out consciously as trans, or they came out in a kind of self-identificatory way. So that's one important point of the trans immigrant community that exists in New Brunswick. Liza Mendez actually was able to get her documentation, and she's on the path to citizenship, in part because her asylum case noted her as a homosexual man. That is a type of what I characterize as ontological violence, which Dean Spade calls administrative violence. It's kind of an erasure of what was really going on, which in her case was, much of it was tied to gender oppression, although sexual oppression is always linked within that. But anyway, long story short, the Latinx trans community in New Brunswick formed in part through its connection to Lorena Borjas. Lorena Borjas was a transgender woman from Mexico who lived in Queens, New York from 1980 until her passing in March 2020 from coronavirus, unfortunately. She was a mother figure in the Latinx community in Queens, as well as the community in New Brunswick. And New Brunswick, again, is about 2.5 hours away from New York City. So Lorena Borjas acted as a model for Mercedes Martinez, who is kind of a mother figure in the New Brunswick, New Jersey trans Latinx community. And this is a quote from...
Could you slow down a little bit? You have 7 minutes left, 6 or 7 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. So Mercedes, this is a quote from her. She says, before the pandemic, we organized events to help each other as trans women. We organized dances to collect funds, say someone was sick, or if someone died, we could have the funds to send her body back to her home country. They organized 5 shows like this before the pandemic hit. And these shows, importantly, were not attended by just trans people, but cis people also came to the shows. And they're not called drag shows, or they didn't call them drag shows. They called them shows, events, where they would perform prominent Latinx artists like Paulina Rubio, and they would cook food and sell food at these events as well to collect funds. So one of the ways in which I analyze the kinds of mutual aid projects that these trans Latinx immigrants were involved in, and also their relationship to the Latinx community as a whole, is through their work lives. So we need to know a lot more, in my opinion, about the working patterns of trans people and where they work. And because in New Brunswick specifically, the majority of them work in factories and warehouses in central New Jersey. This is a picture of where Mercedes Martinez worked at the time of our interview at a cosmetics factory. Prior to that, she worked at a perfume factory and a clothing factory. And this research indicates that these trans women are steeped in the labor patterns, the historical labor patterns of undocumented immigrants. And it's a tenuous type of employment because it's not based on full-time employment. It doesn't come with benefits. And because many of these people are undocumented, they don't have a lot of recourses if they are terminated based on discrimination or other reasons. So one of the quotes that I would like to highlight is Mercedes Martinez talking about her factory work. And she says on the right-hand side in English, "I was discriminated against in a factory where I used to work because they didn't permit me to use the women's bathroom. The boss didn't want me to go in because I'm a trans woman. He wanted me to bring him papers certifying that I was a woman who was totally trans." And as a side note, I think oral histories are a really important method because They highlight the language that trans people use to describe their experiences, as opposed to what cis people or cis-dominated medical fields have used to describe trans people's experiences. You know, she doesn't say fully transitioned. She doesn't say, you know, post-op, for example. She says que yo era una chica totalmente trans. I was a woman who was totally trans, not even totally a woman. So there's a lot here. There's a lot of rich language, linguistic diversities that come out of these oral histories as well. But in here, in particular, what the transphobia does in the workplace is threaten the unification of the workforce itself. So that's one of the consequences of transphobia within the Latinx community, is that as a result, the community itself, which is already impoverished and already lacks a lot of resources, it exacerbates that situation through its transphobia. But
you have 3 minutes left.
All right, but one of the most exciting aspects, I think, of this research is that despite the transphobia that exists within the Latinx community, there are elements of the community itself that actually nurture trans community development and survival. And one of this is the cultural elements that have nurtured the growth of the community. You know, one of the questions that I ask in my research is, why New Brunswick? Why do trans people live in New Brunswick when New York City is so close, when Philadelphia is so close, and when in fact they travel to New York City for their healthcare needs? Because, like I said, despite the concentration of healthcare resources in New Brunswick, they don't go to them. And one of the reasons that I think that trans people still live in New Brunswick is because of the large Oaxacan cultural influence on the city's immigrant community. Oaxaca, as is shown here in the picture, is a southern state, and it's home to about 15 indigenous communities, one of which is the Zapotec, and one of which, the Zapotec, has the third gender category known as Mushe. Now, the women that I interviewed are not indigenous, in the sense that they are not tied to indigenous communities in Mexico. However, Diana Gonzalez is a trans woman who I interviewed, and she speculates that the influence of these cultures on the broader Mexican Oaxacan culture infuses trans women in New Brunswick with a cultural resource, and infuses the Latinx community in general with a cultural resource that makes non-conforming gender identities more palatable, more understandable, and more acceptable within the community. So that is one result of my research, that there are elements that emerge from racialized and ethnic cultures that trans people of color come from, that actually demonstrate and illustrate other ways to be trans. And lastly, I'll just have to say that the pandemic hit in 2020, and the community was totally devastated, economically speaking, because again, most of them work in the essential workforce, and those are the workforces that were totally hit. So I'd just like to say that in general, I think, you know, I would characterize a lot of trans research as focusing on identity or subjectivity, and instead my analysis highlights them as racialized workers and as individuals burdened by a unique set of material conditions, which is necessary to understand because it allows us to see that gender normativity is a foundational category of being that organizes society. And so I think focusing on race and ethnicity and gender within these populations, within trans populations, is a great way to move forward. And thank you for your time. And sorry again for the problems in the beginning.
Thank you, Leo. This was a very, very exciting panel. Unfortunately, we don't have any time left for questions and answers. I think some questions and answers have been answered in the chat and in the question and answer section. We have to close this Zoom room now, and we'll see you in the next Zoom room.
Sorry,
Yes.
Francisco, I just want to interject real quick. I just want to let folks know that we're happy to keep, if you're asking friends to join the conference or request scholarships, we're happy to keep the conference room open, or we're happy to keep registration open, but please tell people to be patient. We're processing things manually as it comes in. It may take at least an hour to get you on the platform, so we can't do that immediately. So just let people know.
Okay, thank you. And we can continue the questions and answers on the Whova platform. And thank all of you, speakers and attendees. See you in the next session.
Enjoy your lunch.